The conference room on the 14th floor of Meridian Tech gleamed with polished surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Veronica Chen stood at the head of the mahogany table, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she paced. 47 employees sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting between their new CEO and the door. Veronica had been CEO for exactly 3 months. She'd swept in after the previous leadership had retired, armed with an MBA from an elite business school and a reputation for efficiency optimization. That was corporate speak for cutting costs wherever possible, and everyone knew it. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," Veronica began, her voice crisp and businesslike. "As you know, we're implementing significant structural changes to ensure Meridian Tech remains competitive in today's market." Marcus Williams pushed his cleaning cart quietly along the back wall, trying to make himself invisible. At 62 years old, he'd perfected the art of moving through spaces without disturbing anyone. He'd been Meridian Tech's night janitor for 17 years, but he'd been called in early today for some emergency spill on the 14th floor. He figured he'd clean up and slip out before the meeting really got started. But Veronica's sharp eyes caught the movement. "You," she said suddenly, pointing at Marcus. "Stop right there." Marcus froze, his weathered hand still gripping the cart handle. 47 pairs of eyes turned to look at him. "What's your name?" Veronica demanded. "Marcus, ma'am. Marcus Williams. I'm just cleaning up that coffee spill by the Marcus." "Yes." Veronica pulled out her tablet, scrolling through it with one manicured fingernail. "You're one of our janitorial staff." "Perfect timing, actually. You're going to help me illustrate a point." Marcus shifted his weight uncomfortably. He'd been in this building long enough to recognize danger when he saw it. "You see," Veronica continued, addressing the room now, "this company has become bloated. We're paying for services we don't need, positions that don't add value. We have 3 janitors on staff when we could easily contract that work out for a fraction of the cost." A few people in the room exchanged glances. Sarah Chen, the head of HR, looked pale.
"Ms.
Chen, I think perhaps we should discuss this in," Sarah began. "No," Veronica cut her off. "Transparency is one of my core values. Everyone should understand the reasoning behind these difficult decisions." She turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Williams, you make $42,000 a year, plus benefits. We've analyzed your productivity metrics, and quite frankly, you're our least efficient janitor. You take longer to clean the same spaces. You've called in sick 4 times this year, and you're simply not keeping pace with the demands of a modern workplace." Marcus felt his face grow hot. His hands trembled slightly on the cart handle. He thought about those sick days, too, for his daughter's chemotherapy appointments. One for his grandson's emergency, when his daughter couldn't take him, and one when his own blood pressure had spiked so high he'd nearly passed out. "Ma'am, he started. "I'm terminating your employment, effective immediately," Veronica said flatly. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings. We'll mail your final paycheck." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Marcus stood frozen, humiliation washing over him in waves. 17 years of arriving at 11 p.m. and leaving at 7 a.m., of cleaning up after other people, of taking pride in his work even when no one noticed. "This is what leadership looks like," Veronica said to the room, raising her voice over the whispers. "Making tough calls, not being afraid to." The door to the conference room burst open. 5 people walked in, led by an elderly woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a simple but expensive navy suit and moved with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms. "Miss Chen," the woman said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I'm going to have to stop you right there." Veronica's confident expression flickered. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "This is a private company meeting. I'm Margaret Stokes," the woman said. and I believe we've met. I'm the chairwoman of Meridian Tech's board of directors. You remember, I was on the hiring committee that approved your appointment as CEO. The color drained from Veronica's face. These are my fellow board members, Margaret continued, gesturing to the 4 people behind her. We happened to be in the building for our quarterly review meeting when we heard raised voices. Imagine our surprise when we discovered our new CEO publicly humiliating an employee. I was simply making a business decision, Veronica said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. Cost-cutting measures that you made without consulting the board, without following proper HR protocols, and apparently without bothering to do even basic research. Margaret walked slowly toward Marcus, who still stood frozen by his cart. Mr. Williams, would you mind staying for just a few more minutes? Marcus nodded, unable to find his voice. Margaret turned to face the room. I'd like to tell you all a story about this company. Meridian Tech was founded 32 years ago by my late husband, Robert Stokes, and his best friend, James Caldwell. They started in a garage with nothing but an idea and a dream. When they got their first real office space, a tiny suite in a rundown building in the industrial district. They couldn't afford much, but they knew they needed help keeping it clean, professional. She paused, letting the silence settle. They hired a young man, barely 20 years old, who was putting himself through community college. That young man worked harder than anyone they'd ever seen. He cleaned that office until it shone. He stayed late when they stayed late. He celebrated with them when they got their first big client. And when Robert's wife, that's me, went into premature labor with our daughter, that young man drove Robert to the hospital because Robert was too panicked to drive himself. Margaret's voice grew softer. That young man was Marcus Williams. The room was dead silent now. Veronica stood very still, her tablet hanging limply in her hand. Marcus stayed with us as the company grew, Margaret continued. When we moved to bigger offices, Marcus moved with us. He worked his way through college, earned his associate degree. He could have gone on to other things, but he stayed. Do you know why? No one answered. Loyalty, Margaret said. And because my husband made him a promise. Robert promised Marcus that as long as Meridian Tech existed, Marcus would have a place here. That he'd be taken care of. That his family would be taken care of. She turned to Marcus, her eyes glistening. I haven't always been in the office these past years, Marcus. Since Robert passed, I've let the board and the management teams run operations. But I should have checked in more. I should have visited. I'm sorry, I didn't know that you've been going through difficult times with your daughter. Marcus's eyes widened. How did you? I called Sarah in HR about 20 minutes ago, after we heard what was happening up here, Margaret said gently. She told me everything. About your daughter's illness, about your grandson you're helping to raise, about how you've never once complained or asked for special treatment, despite everything you're dealing with. She turned back to Veronica, and her voice turned to steel. Miss Chen, you've been CEO for 3 months. In that time, you've made exactly 0 efforts to understand this company's culture, its history, or its values. You've treated employees like line items on a spreadsheet. You've broken promises made by the founders. And worst of all, you've done it with arrogance and cruelty. The janitorial costs, Veronica tried, are not your primary concern, Margaret snapped. Building a company that people are proud to work for, that should be your concern. Creating an environment where people feel valued, that should be your concern. Honoring the legacy of the people who built this company from nothing, that absolutely should be your concern. One of the other board members, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, stepped forward. Miss Chen, the board will be meeting in emergency session this afternoon. You'll be notified of our decision. In the meantime, you're suspended from your duties, effective immediately. Veronica's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Sarah, Margaret said, turning to the HR director, Would you please escort Miss Chen to her office to collect her personal items? Sarah stood quickly, relief evident on her face. Of course, Mrs. Stokes. As Veronica was led from the room, shoulders slumped in defeat, Margaret addressed the remaining employees. I apologize that you all had to witness this. It was unprofessional and frankly cruel. Please know that the board takes these matters seriously. We will be conducting a thorough review of recent decisions and policies. She walked over to Marcus, who had tears streaming down his weathered face. Marcus, she said quietly, Robert thought the world of you. So do I. I want you to take the rest of the week off, paid, to be with your daughter and grandson. When you come back, I'd like you to come to my office. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your future here. Marcus could barely speak. Mrs. Stokes, I thank you. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Margaret said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Just know that you're valued here. You always have been. As Marcus wiped his eyes, several employees stood up and began applauding. It started slowly, then built until the entire room was on its feet, clapping for the quiet janitor who'd served them all for 17 years without fanfare or recognition. 3 months later, the 14th floor conference room was packed again, but the atmosphere was completely different. There was laughter, conversation, and the smell of catered food. Marcus stood near the windows, looking uncomfortable in a new suit. His daughter, Lisa, stood beside him, thinner than she'd been before chemotherapy but smiling brightly. His 7-year-old grandson, Deshaun, was running around with other employees' children, causing happy chaos. Margaret clinked a glass, calling for attention. Thank you all for coming to today's celebration, she said. As many of you know, we've made significant changes over the past few months. We have a new CEO promoted from within, who actually understands what this company stands for. We've restructured our compensation and benefits packages to better support our employees' needs, and we've established the Robert Stokes Legacy Fund, which will provide support for employees facing medical or family emergencies. She smiled at Marcus. But today, we're here for a special reason. Marcus Williams has been with Meridian Tech for 17 years. In that time, he's been far more than a janitor. He's been a friend, a steady presence, and a living embodiment of this company's values. After much discussion with Marcus, we've created a new position, Director of Facilities and Employee Wellness. Marcus will be overseeing not just our facilities management, but also serving as an advocate for employee needs and concerns. The room erupted in applause. Marcus's daughter squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. I never imagined, Marcus said, his voice shaking as he stepped forward. When I started cleaning offices as a 20-year-old kid, I never imagined I'd end up here. I just wanted to do good work, to take care of my family. Mrs. Stokes, Mr. Stokes, all of you, you gave me more than a job. You gave me dignity. You gave me hope. And you taught me that the measure of a company isn't in its profits, but in how it treats people when no one's watching. He paused, looking around the room at faces he'd seen for years, people he'd cleaned up after, helped in small ways, watched grow in their careers. I want to promise you all something, he continued. In this new role, I'm going to work every day to make sure that what almost happened to me never happens to anyone else here. That everyone who works at Meridian Tech, from the mail room to the executive suite, feels valued and respected. That's the legacy Mr. Stokes would have wanted. That's the legacy I want to build. As the applause washed over him again, Marcus caught Margaret's eye. She nodded at him, a small smile on her lips, and he saw in her expression the same promise he'd seen in her husband's face 3 decades ago. You belong here. You matter. We'll take care of you. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Marcus found himself alone in the conference room for a moment, looking out at the city lights. He thought about that morning 3 months ago, about the humiliation, the fear, the certainty that everything he'd built was crumbling. But he also thought about what came after, about Margaret standing up for him, about his co-workers applauding, about his daughter's proud face, and his grandson's excitement about Grandpa's big new job. He thought about the quiet strength it took to show up every day and do work that others didn't notice, didn't appreciate, didn't see. And he thought about how the right people, the right leaders could change everything with a single moment of recognition, of justice, of compassion. Pretty good view from up here, isn't it? Marcus turned to find Margaret standing in the doorway. It is, he agreed. Though I've got to say, Mrs. Stokes, I always liked the view from the night shift, too. There's something peaceful about an empty building at 2 a.m. when the city's quiet, and you can just think. Margaret laughed. Robert used to say the same thing. He'd work late sometimes, and you two would talk. He told me once that you were one of the wisest people he'd ever met. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He was a good man. He was. And he'd be proud of you, Marcus. So proud. She paused. You know what he told me once? He said, Margaret, character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when no one would ever know. Marcus has more character in his little finger than most executives have in their whole body. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. Mrs. Stokes, Marcus said finally, why did you really create this position for me? I appreciate it more than I can say, but we both know you could have just given me a raise, apologized, and moved on. Margaret considered the question carefully. Because, Marcus, companies forget. They forget their history, their values, their promises. They bring in new people who only see numbers and efficiency metrics. And before you know it, the soul of the place is gone. She looked at him intently. You're the soul of this place, Marcus. You remember when we were small, when everyone knew everyone, when we were a family. I need you to help us remember that as we grow. To make sure we never lose sight of what really matters. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a lot of responsibility. It is, but if anyone can handle it, you can, she smiled. Besides, you've been taking care of this company for 17 years. Now we're just making it official. As they walked out together, turning off the lights behind them, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed because their work didn't seem important enough. He thought about all the quiet janitors, the maintenance workers, the mailroom clerks, the security guards, all the people who kept the world running while others climbed the ladder above them. And he promised himself that in his new role, he'd make sure their voices were heard. Their work was valued, their dignity was protected. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Not the title, not the salary, not the corner office. It was about treating people like they mattered, like they were seen, like they belonged. And in a world that too often forgot that simple truth, Marcus Williams was determined to be a reminder. As he drove home that night, past the gleaming office towers and bustling streets, past the coffee shop, and restaurants and stores where other workers, seen and unseen, kept the city alive, Marcus smiled. Tomorrow he'd start his new job. Tomorrow he'd begin building a legacy of compassion and justice. Tomorrow he'd show up and fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. But tonight, he'd go home and tuck his grandson into bed and sit with his daughter and be grateful for the simple miracle of being valued, of being seen, of being home. And that was more than enough.